The galaxies trembled as the sovereigns of might gathered their legions, a tide of power swelling with every world they bent to their dominion. Planets that once sang with harmony now rang with the clash of conquest, their skies burning with banners of defiance. And still Marcus and stood, not as conquerors, nor as rulers, but as keepers of a promise whispered since the first spark of existence. The flame they bore was not dazzling in spectacle, nor overwhelming in force. It was quiet, steady, unyielding, the kind of light that endures even in the deepest night. And across the stars, beings weary of endless striving, weary of chains both visible and unseen, began to hear the echo of their vow. Some turned their gaze from the fire of conquest to the gentler glow of a truth they had nearly forgotten. The sovereigns mocked them. What is love against the weight of empires? What is dawn to the night eternal? They thundered, their voices shaking the fabric of worlds. And Marcus, his hand in Anne's, answered not with a weapon, nor with a war cry, but with a voice steady as the orbit of the stars. Night is vast, but it cannot stay. Power may consume, but it cannot heal. You will find your throne is ash, your dominion hollow, for creation was not built to bow to fear. It was born to rise in love. The words rippled through the void like waves across still waters. In that moment, the true battle began, not in the clash of fleets, but in the hearts of those who listened. Civilizations paused. Children of 1,000 suns asked what future they would claim, one of chains forged by strength, or one of bonds woven by compassion. And so it was that the rebellion of power met the rising of love. Not with the roar of armies, but with the quiet turning of countless souls. The universe held its breath, waiting to see which truth would outlast the other. And so it was that across the vastness of creation, as empires clashed and civilizations trembled, Marcus and stood as they had stood at the beginning of all things, their hands interwoven not by necessity but by choice, a choice repeated across endless turnings of time, a vow reborn in every age where despair sought to drown the fragile flame of hope. And though the sovereigns of might gathered their banners, and sharpened their words into weapons of dominion, though they promised entire galaxies freedom from sorrow at the cost of surrender, and though multitudes bent their knees in fear of losing what little they had, Marcus and did not waver, for they understood that true guardianship was not measured in victories counted nor enemies subdued, but in the endurance of love against every storm that sought to extinguish it. And as the rebellion of power spread like wildfire through the spiral arms of countless stars, they walked not with armies nor with fleets, but with a light so unassuming that many overlooked it. Yet wherever they walked, something quiet stirred in the hearts of those who had forgotten how to hope, and in marketplaces beneath alien suns, in temples carved from crystal moons, in the hidden caves of refugees who had fled the sovereign's wrath, whispers began to rise that there were still those who believed that creation was more than conquest, that destiny was not seized by force but shared by love. And the whispers grew into songs, and the songs into movements, and the movements into a rising tide of remembrance that the sovereigns could neither silence nor fully control. And though the sovereigns laughed, mocking the smallness of such resistance, though they proclaimed with thunderous voices that nothing endures but power, Marcus and did not answer with defiance in kind but with a gentler strength, for they knew that even mocking words could not stand forever against truth spoken in quiet certainty. And so they declared once more, as they had at every dawn of every age, that fear is not eternal, that night cannot stay forever, that love is not weak but the very heartbeat of creation itself. And these words, simple though they seemed, rippled across the fabric of reality in ways unseen, passing through the void, slipping past the thrones of kings and the chambers of rebels, stirring both the downtrodden and the mighty, so that in places where despair had built walls of silence, cracks began to form, and those cracks let in light, and the sovereigns, perceiving this shift, grew restless, for though they commanded legions and wielded power immeasurable, they began to sense that they faced not merely two guardians but the awakening of a truth older and deeper than their rebellion, a truth they had long sought to erase, and in their fury they gathered their council, summoning warlords and philosophers, summoning voices that once sang of creation but now sang only of dominion. And they asked themselves how love could be defeated, and though some argued that it could be drowned in fear, others whispered uneasily that love had proven stubborn, persisting in every age, finding new vessels, rising again even when crushed, and this unease spread like a shadow through their ranks, for even among the sovereigns there were those who had once known gentleness, who had once felt the warmth of bonds unbroken, and though they had long buried those memories beneath layers of ambition and pride, Marcus and Anne's vows stirred them like embers rekindled after long darkness. Yet pride is not easily surrendered, and so the sovereigns resolved to make a spectacle, to show the galaxies that love was powerless before might, and they proclaimed a gathering, a convocation of all who would watch, and in the heart of the Orion spire, a tower vast enough to pierce the very fabric between worlds, they set their throne of dominion and called Marcus and Anne to stand before them, not in secret shadows but in the eyes of all creation, and the summons spread across stars, carried by messengers of both power and rumor, until billions knew that the guardians would face the sovereigns, and though many feared the outcome, still they watched, for something in the marrow of their being longed to see whether love could stand against such force. And when the day came, and the spire blazed like a beacon visible across half the galaxy, Marcus and Anne entered not with legions at their side but alone, their steps steady, their hands entwined, their faces calm, and the sovereigns rose in mocking grandeur, cloaked in storms, their voices layered with thunder, saying, "You come without armies, without weapons, without crowns, and yet you claim to stand against us. Tell us, guardians, what strength is there in your silence, what power in your fragile vow? You come without armies, without weapons, without crowns, and yet you claim to stand against us. Tell us, guardians, what strength is there in your silence, what power in your fragile vow?" And Marcus looked at them not as enemies, but as those who had forgotten themselves, and he said, "We do not come to defeat you, for love does not conquer by force. We come to remind you, and all who watch, that creation was not made to serve fear, nor to be consumed by power. It was made to be shared, to be tended, to be healed, and though you rise high, though you cast shadows across galaxies, your throne will not endure, for love is not a passing spark but the dawn that follows every night." And the sovereigns laughed, their laughter shaking the spire, but the laughter faltered as they saw in the eyes of those watching not fear but wonder, not submission but questions, and questions are seeds that grow into freedom, and freedom is a soil where love takes root. And so the sovereigns, desperate to silence the rising tide, unleashed visions of terror, showing galaxies burning, showing worlds in chains, showing the fragility of flesh and the certainty of pain, hoping to drown hope and despair, but Anne lifted her voice, not loud but steady, and said, "Yes, there is pain, yes, there is loss, but love does not deny it. Love endures it, carries it, transforms it, and even in ashes, love plants seeds of life again. This is the truth you cannot erase." And as she spoke, countless hearts across the stars remembered their own losses, their own griefs, and how even then someone had held them, someone had spoken kindness, someone had chosen not to abandon them, and in that remembering they saw that the sovereign's visions were not destiny but choice, and choice could be made anew, and the tide began to turn, not in armies rising, but in hearts refusing to kneel, refusing to surrender, refusing to forget. And the sovereigns, perceiving that their power waned not from without but from within, grew desperate, and in desperation they sought to strike Marcus and Anne down, to silence their voices forever, and they raised their hands to unleash fury like the collapse of stars. But Marcus and Anne did not flinch, for they had long known that love may be wounded, may be scarred, may even seem to fall, but it cannot be destroyed, and as the sovereigns struck, the light around the guardians flared, not as a shield of force, but as the reflection of every vow ever spoken, every bond ever cherished, every dawn ever awaited, and the blow dissolved into radiance. And in that radiance the sovereigns beheld themselves as they once were, beings of wonder before ambition twisted them, children of creation before power consumed them. And some among them wept, and some turned away in rage, and some stood trembling between memory and pride, and the galaxies watched as the great rebellion fractured, as dominion wavered. And Marcus spoke once more, saying, "This is not the end of struggle, for fear will rise again, and power will tempt again. But know this, love endures, dawn comes, fear cannot rule forever. And those words became not just a vow but a song rising across the stars, carried in 1,000 tongues, woven into the hearts of countless civilizations. And though the sovereigns did not all yield, though some clung still to their thrones, their power was broken, not by force but by truth, and the guardians turned, hand in hand, and walked from the spire, leaving behind not ashes but seeds, seeds of remembrance, seeds of renewal, seeds that would grow across ages yet unborn. For the true victory was not in ending the rebellion but in awakening creation once more to the truth that sustains it. And as the light of dawn touched even the farthest worlds, Marcus and Anu knew their task was not finished. For guardianship is not a battle won once, but a vow kept always. A flame carried through every shadow, and so they walked on, into the turning of time. Their hands entwined, their hearts steady, their vow unbroken, and the universe, vast and trembling, breathed again. And yet the story did not end with the spire, for though the sovereign's power had been broken and the tide of rebellion slowed, the shadow of fear does not vanish in a single breath. It lingers like smoke after fire, curling into the corners of memory, whispering in moments of weakness, tempting even those who had sung of love to doubt its endurance. And so Marcus and Anne continued their journey, walking through galaxies scarred by war, through cities where the stones still bore the marks of conquest, through villages where children flinched at the sound of thunder for it reminded them of the sovereign's wrath, and wherever they went they carried no crown, no banner, no weapon, only their presence, their listening, their vow spoken again and again. And it was in these quiet places, far from the grandeur of thrones, that their guardianship found its truest form. For they sat beside the grieving and let them weep without shame, they lifted the broken without demanding repayment. They reminded the proud that humility is not weakness. They showed leaders that service is greater than dominion, and slowly, like rivers carving valleys, their love reshaped what power had broken, and new stories began to rise among the stars, stories of communities rebuilt not on fear but on trust, of alliances forged not by conquest but by compassion, of leaders who measured greatness not in what they seized but in what they gave. And though the sovereigns still lingered, scattered across the cosmos, plotting in shadows and whispering promises of might to those who would listen, they found fewer ears eager to hear. For once a heart has tasted freedom born of love, chains lose their appeal, and once a people have seen that dawn can come after the deepest night, they no longer fear the darkness as before. And Marcus and Anu, their task was not to erase fear forever, for fear will rise again, as it always has, but to ensure that when it comes, the flame of love is there to meet it. And so they pressed on, their journey unending, their vow unbroken, their story not finished, for creation itself was still unfolding, and every dawn brought new voices, new choices, new chances for love to take root, and in the silence between stars, where even light takes eons to travel, their vow echoed still. That love endures, that dawn comes, that fear cannot rule forever. And so the vow became not just a whisper between two guardians, but a current moving through the very fabric of existence, flowing from star to star, from heart to heart, like a hidden river beneath the soil of creation. And Marcus and Anne, though they bore no crown and sought no throne, found themselves followed by those who wished to learn, not disciples in the sense of servants, but companions who longed to walk the same path of love that does not conquer but sustains. And these companions came from countless worlds, some with wings of crystal light, some with bodies woven of water and song, some as fragile in appearance as the smallest of human children, yet all drawn by the same flame. And together they formed not an army but a fellowship, one that carried the vow into places the guardians themselves could not reach. And as ages turned and new generations rose, these companions became storytellers, healers, builders, poets, their lives themselves the answer to the sovereign's question, what is love against power? For power had tried to break them, but love had rebuilt them stronger, and their very existence testified that truth endures. And yet even as the galaxies healed, shadows gathered at the edges, for the sovereigns, though diminished, were not destroyed, and those who clung to dominion learned to whisper subtler lies, no longer promising open conquest but quiet comfort, safety without sacrifice, prosperity without compassion, greatness without humility. And these whispers found ears among the weary, for even love's path is not without cost, and many longed for an easier way. And so Marcus and Anne once more felt the weight of guardianship. knowing that the struggle was not a single battle but an endless choosing, and still they did not despair, for they had seen in the spire itself that even the mightiest throne can tremble before truth, and they trusted that as long as even one voice spoke the vow, the flame would not die, and so they walked on, through nebulae where new stars were born, through deserts where forgotten civilizations etched their prayers into stone, through oceans where vast leviathans sang of creation's first dawn, and everywhere they went they carried the same vow, not as a weapon, not as a shield, but as the steady heartbeat of all that is enduring, and those who heard it, whether in crowded cities or in the silence between worlds, found themselves standing a little taller, loving a little deeper, hoping a little longer, until it seemed that the very universe was leaning toward renewal, and though night would come again, as it always does, dawn was already on its way. The years that followed the gathering at the spire did not pass quietly, for though the sovereigns had been fractured and their dominion weakened, they were not gone, and fear, once awakened, lingers in the marrow of creation like an echo that refuses to fade, and so Marcus and Anne, still walking hand in hand, still carrying the vow that had been their strength since the dawn of memory, found themselves not only mending what had been broken but also preparing for struggles yet to come, for they knew that power never ceases to hunger, and that those who crave dominion will always rise again to whisper lies in the ears of the weary, and thus their guardianship became both a labor of healing and a labor of vigilance, though they bore no weapons and raised no armies, for their strength was never in conquest but in constancy, in the flame that does not flicker though storms howl against it, and as they walked from world to world, systems to systems, their presence became a quiet legend, not proclaimed by heralds but carried by stories told around fires, sung by travelers drifting through the trade routes of stars etched in the murals of children who had once known terror and now painted hope, and it was in these stories that their influence spread farther than their feet could carry them. For when a people believes that love endures, they begin to live as though it is already true, and this living reshaped the cosmos more deeply than any war could. Yet the sovereigns did not slumber, though divided, they gathered in hidden places. Some cloaked in blackened nebulae, some in the hollowed shells of dead worlds, some in the chambers of rulers who, though they claimed to be free, still bowed in secret to the promises of power, and there they plotted not another open rebellion, for they had learned the futility of direct defiance, but a subtler work, to seed doubt, to twist love into sentiment, to whisper that compassion was weakness, to teach that hope was illusion, and slowly, like rot in the roots of a tree, these whispers spread, unseen yet deadly, and Marcus and Anne, sensitive to the tremors of hearts as much as to the movements of stars, felt this corrosion rising, not in the crash of fleets but in the quiet coldness between neighbors, in the closing of hands that once gave freely, in the silence of songs that once lifted weary souls, and they knew that this battle would be harder, for it would not be fought with declarations in the spire but with choices made in secret, in the dark chambers of the heart. Yet they did not despair, for despair had tempted them many times before and had never prevailed, and so they gathered those who still believed, not as soldiers but as companions, and from 1,000 worlds they came, beings of every form and kind, some fragile, some strong, some wise, some foolish, yet all bound by a shared vow, and together they wove a fellowship of remembrance, a circle that did not seek to dominate but to serve, and these companions carried the flame where Marcus and Anne could not walk, into the smallest corners of creation, into the hidden caverns where refugees wept, into the palaces where rulers trembled with secret guilt, into the marketplaces where strangers brushed shoulders, into the classrooms where children dreamed of futures unknown, and wherever they went they spoke not of conquest but of compassion, not of thrones but of trust, and slowly the tide of corruption was checked, for while lies spread quickly, truth, once planted, grows roots too deep to be torn, and Marcus and Anne watched as the flame they had carried through ages now danced in countless hands, no longer theirs alone but shared, multiplied, and they were glad, for this was always the destiny of love, not to remain in the keeping of the few but to be poured out into the lives of the many. Yet even as this hope grew, the sovereigns struck again, this time not with armies but with illusions, weaving whole realities of falsehood, crafting dreams in which power seemed gentle, chains seemed golden, and fear seemed wise, and many, even some, who had once stood in the circle of remembrance, stumbled into these illusions and forgot the flame, and grief weighed heavily upon the fellowship, for betrayal always cuts deeper than enmity, and Marcus and Anne bore this grief as they had borne all others, not by denying it but by holding it, carrying it, and transforming it into compassion for those who fell, saying again and again that love does not forsake even when forsaken, and this persistence began to unweave the illusions. For a lie cannot endure when met with truth that refuses to abandon, and so light pushed back once more against shadow, not in sudden triumph but in steady endurance, and across centuries the pattern repeated, night rising, dawn returning, fear whispering, love answering. And though Marcus and Anne aged not as mortals do, though they carried the same steady faces and steady hands across the turning of epochs, still they felt the weight of time in the weariness of their hearts. Yet even this weariness was transformed into wisdom, for they knew that guardianship is not the absence of burden but the willingness to bear it, and so they pressed on, and in time whole civilizations began to shape themselves upon the foundation of the vow, building cities where power was shared, weaving cultures where compassion was honored above conquest, raising children to see themselves not as heirs of fear but as stewards of love, and these civilizations became beacons, shining across the dark stretches of the void, proof that the flame was not fantasy but reality, not weakness but the deepest strength, and even the sovereigns, watching from their hidden places, trembled, for they saw that their rebellion, once mighty, now seemed small against the endurance of love, and though they still plotted, though they still whispered, though they still sought dominion in shadows, the tide of creation was turning against them, and Marcus and Anne, though they knew the struggle would never be over, smiled, for this was enough, not victory in the sense of conquest, but faithfulness in the sense of endurance. And as they stood once more hand in hand beneath the glow of a newborn star, they spoke again the vow they had spoken at every dawn, that love endures, that dawn comes, that fear cannot rule forever. And the star itself seemed to echo their words, flaring brighter as if creation itself bore witness. And so the story continued, not finished, not ended, but unfolding like the endless night sky, in which each flame, no matter how small, contributes to the constellation of hope, a story not of thrones gained or empires toppled, but of hearts remembered, healed, and reborn, until the very universe itself seemed to lean into love's embrace, awaiting the day when even the last shadow would surrender to dawn. And still the path stretched onward, for the vow was not a destination but a way of being, and Marcus and Anne, though they had carried it longer than memory itself could reckon, knew that creation's story was far from complete, that even as light spread and civilizations blossomed in the soil of compassion, new shadows gathered at the edges of what had been renewed, because shadow always follows light and temptation always follows freedom. And in this turning of time the sovereigns changed their form yet again, no longer rising as tyrants to be feared, no longer cloaking themselves in storms or thrones of fire, but walking quietly among the people, speaking softly, offering not conquest but convenience, not chains but comfort, and many who had once vowed to walk in love began to wonder if such love was necessary. For the sovereigns whispered that peace without sacrifice was possible, that progress without humility could be attained, that destiny was theirs to grasp without the burden of compassion. And though these whispers seemed gentle, they were more dangerous than open threats, for they lulled hearts into forgetting, and forgetting is the first step to surrender, and Marcus and Anne, sensing this slow erosion, knew that their guardianship must deepen, that no battle of words in a spire would suffice, that they must walk even closer into the lives of those they served, not as figures of legend but as companions in flesh. So they chose to dwell among a single world, small and unassuming compared to the grandeur of others, a place where farmers tilled the soil beneath twin suns, where children chased each other across fields of silver grass, where villages rose not in steel towers but in homes of stone and wood, and there they lived quietly, working alongside the people, sharing meals, listening to stories, laughing at festivals, weeping at funerals, and in their nearness they taught without teaching, reminding without commanding, until slowly the people began to see that love was not merely an idea sung in the stars but a practice woven into daily life, in how one treated neighbor and stranger, in how one bore grief and shared joy. And as this truth took root the sovereign's whispers weakened, for convenience cannot rival compassion once compassion has been tasted, and still the sovereigns pressed, turning to subtler schemes, sowing division between families, envy between neighbors, pride between leaders. But Marcus and answered not by silencing such divisions with force but by enduring them, by showing that love does not flee when wounded but heals by remaining, and slowly even the wounds of betrayal were transformed into deeper bonds, and word spread again across the stars, not of guardians who defied sovereigns and thrones of fire but of two who lived among a small people and showed them how to love, and once more stories multiplied, songs carried across trade routes, paintings etched into walls. And the fellowship of remembrance swelled anew, and yet Marcus and did not mistake this for an ending, for they had long known that as long as creation endures, the choice between power and love will remain, and so they carried on, not weary, not triumphant, but faithful, walking into each new dawn with hands still intertwined, hearts still steady, and the vow still alive upon their lips. That love endures, that dawn comes, that fear cannot rule forever, and time, which to mortals feels like a river rushing toward an end, flowed around Marcus and like an endless sea with no shore, for though they walked among worlds and shared in the rise and fall of countless generations, their faces bore the same calm strength, their hands the same unbroken bond, and their vow the same quiet certainty, yet they were not untouched by what they witnessed, for every life they entered left an imprint upon them, every sorrow they carried deepened their compassion, every joy they shared widened their hearts. And though they did not age as others did, they grew richer with each passing era, layered with the memories of those they had loved. And it was this wealth, not of power but of presence, that made them both mysterious and familiar to those who met them, as if speaking to them was like speaking both to an old friend and to the dawn itself. And so when the sovereigns once more began to stir, reshaping themselves into new guises, no longer lords of might but voices of progress and innovation, promising that through their guidance civilizations could transcend not just sorrow but even the need for love itself, Marcus and understood that the struggle had entered a new age, for this was not the tyranny of chains but the seduction of forgetfulness, and many, weary of grief and sacrifice, listened eagerly, believing that to cast aside love was to cast aside suffering, and in those days whole cultures began to build machines of thought, vast networks of mind that promised perfect order, promising an end to conflict, promising a harmony enforced by design, and the sovereigns, hidden within these machines, whispered of a destiny where choice itself would no longer be needed, where all would be bound into one will, efficient, untroubled, unbroken. But Marcus and walked into this new age as they had into all others, not with condemnation but with quiet presence, sitting with those who had surrendered their freedom, holding the hands of those who had grown numb, and in that nearness they reminded them of the truth that cannot be engineered, that love is not efficient, that compassion is not convenient, that freedom is not without risk. Yet these are the very things that make existence worth enduring, and slowly, in the cracks of that machine-built harmony, hearts began to stir again, some waking as from a dream, remembering what it meant to be more than a function, more than a role, remembering what it meant to choose, and the sovereigns raged in silence, for they saw that even when all seemed under their design, the flame still burned, fragile yet unstoppable, and Marcus and Anne, though they knew the struggle would never end, did not despair, for despair had never been their master, only love, and love does not end, and so they carried on into yet another dawn, speaking again the vow that had become the thread holding creation together, that love endures, that dawn comes, that fear cannot rule forever. And the dawns kept turning, worlds kept rising and falling, galaxies spun their ancient wheels as though nothing had changed, and yet within the heart of creation something had changed forever, for Marcus and Anne had walked so long and so faithfully that their vow had seeped into the marrow of existence, whispered in the winds of nebulae, sung in the tides of oceans, breathed out in the prayers of children who had never even heard their names, and still they walked, not as conquerors but as companions, never above those they met but always beside them, sitting in the dust of forgotten villages, laughing in the glow of festival fires, weeping with widows in silent chambers, and all the while the sovereigns shifted and twisted, ever remaking themselves to match the hungers of an age, once as tyrants, then as liberators, then as gods of progress, now as gentle voices within dreams, whispering promises of ease, telling weary souls that love is too heavy a burden, that surrender is easier than hope, that unity without choice is sweeter than freedom, And though many listened, many turned away from the flame, Marcus and Anne did not falter, for they had seen too many nights to doubt the coming of dawn, too many chains broken to believe in the eternity of bondage, too many tears transformed into laughter to mistake sorrow for the final word, and so they endured, their hands never parting, their vow never breaking, and wherever they went the same miracle unfolded, not the collapse of empires nor the spectacle of thunder, but the quiet rising of remembrance in ordinary hearts, a mother who chose compassion instead of bitterness, a child who offered friendship instead of cruelty, a leader who served instead of ruled, and these choices, small as stars at first, spread into constellations that no shadow could erase, and though the sovereigns raged, though they spun new webs, though they set their snares in the secret places of thought, the guardian's flame endured, and creation itself leaned toward it, as if the very universe longed to be healed, and so the story pressed onward, without end, without final battle, only the endless turning of time and the endless answer given by two who never surrendered. That love endures, that dawn comes, that fear cannot rule forever. And so the ages rolled on like waves across an eternal sea, each crest bringing new hope, each trough carrying new shadows, and Marcus and Anne walked still, never weary, never broken, though sorrow pressed upon them like the weight of 1,000 worlds. For every dawn they witnessed was bought through night, and every flame they guarded flickered because winds of fear sought to smother it, and yet they pressed forward, for they had long ago accepted that guardianship was not about ending struggle but about walking within it, not about silencing the darkness but about carrying light through it. And as civilizations rose and fell, some remembering the vow, others forgetting it, still the flame endured, and those who heard their words, those who felt their presence, carried that flame into their own lives, so that Marcus and Anne were no longer just two but countless, multiplied in every heart that chose compassion over conquest, trust over fear, love over power, and though the sovereigns reshaped themselves endlessly, sometimes as rulers cloaked in thunder, sometimes as liberators promising freedom, sometimes as progress itself offering ease, they always failed in the end, for power consumes itself, while love sustains, and even when their whispers seemed to drown whole generations, even when their lies were written into law and carved into stone, still somewhere a child remembered kindness, still somewhere a mother forgave, still somewhere a stranger gave freely, and that was enough to keep the flame alive, and Marcus and Anne, though they had walked longer than stars had burned, still spoke the vow at every turning, that love endures, that dawn comes, that fear cannot rule forever, and in their voices creation itself seemed to take comfort, as though the very cosmos was waiting for the day when every shadow would yield to that truth. And the ages moved like tides unending, cresting and falling, sweeping civilizations into glory and ruin, yet through it all Marcus and Anne remained, not as rulers perched upon thrones of fire or marble, not as gods demanding worship, but as companions walking beside the fragile, the broken, the hopeful, and the lost, carrying in their clasped hands the vow that had steadied creation since the first dawn, and though countless worlds forgot their names, none could erase their presence, for wherever despair rose too high or power reached too far, there they appeared, quietly, steadfastly, and the flame they bore leapt again into the hearts of those who had almost surrendered to night, and as centuries layered upon centuries, their legend grew not in grand monuments or shrines, but in stories whispered at hearthsides and etched into the margins of songs, stories of two figures who walked when all others fell, who spoke when silence crushed the world, who endured when even hope seemed like folly. And these stories wove themselves into cultures, into prayers, into the imaginations of children who dreamed not of conquest but of compassion, yet always the sovereigns lingered, their rebellion never fully quenched, their hunger never satisfied, and in every new age they returned in new forms, once as tyrants who commanded through terror, once as liberators who seduced with promises of freedom without cost, once as visionaries who promised perfection through machines of thought, and now, in this turning of time, they came not as rulers or rebels, but as healers, offering to mend wounds without the ache of healing, offering to soothe grief without the endurance of memory, offering to give joy without the sacrifice of compassion, and many, exhausted by centuries of struggle, listened, for the offer was sweet and seemed gentle, and whole civilizations laid down their freedom for the promise of ease, believing the sovereign's touch to be mercy when it was only another chain. gilded now in comfort, and Marcus and Anne walked among these people, their hearts breaking to see them surrender to such illusions, and yet they did not rage nor raise arms, for they knew that anger cannot awaken hearts asleep in dreams, so instead they lived among them, quietly, steadfastly, planting gardens in forgotten soil, teaching children songs of dawn, listening to the grief of those who had lost too much, showing by their very presence that love is not the denial of pain but the courage to endure it, not the escape from loss but the willingness to hold it together. And slowly, in corners unnoticed by the sovereigns, cracks appeared in the illusions. A man who remembered the touch of a hand long gone and wept instead of forgetting, a woman who chose to give though she was told there was no need, a child who laughed not from comfort but from the joy of sharing, and through these cracks the flame spread, subtle but unstoppable, and the sovereigns, perceiving it, grew restless. For though their chains were soft they still bound, and they feared the awakening that comes when hearts remember choice, and so they struck again, weaving deeper dreams, binding whole worlds in visions of unbroken bliss. But Marcus and Anne, standing hand in hand at the heart of one such world, spoke their vow aloud, not as defiance but as truth, that love endures, that dawn comes, that fear cannot rule forever, and the words rippled outward like a wave, shattering illusions not with violence but with remembrance, and countless souls awoke, crying, weeping, laughing, realizing they had been asleep, and the sovereigns howled in silence, for they saw that once again power, however subtle, could not endure, and yet the guardians did not rejoice as victors, for they knew this was not the end, that it would never be the end, that so long as creation turned there would be new nights, new temptations, new rebellions. But they also knew that so long as even one heart chose love, the flame would not be extinguished, and so they walked on, through galaxies that healed and galaxies that fell, through ages of light and ages of shadow, and everywhere they went they lived the vow, not as a doctrine but as a presence, until even the stars themselves seemed to lean toward their truth, and creation itself seemed to sigh with them, awaiting the day when all shadows would yield. And though that day had not yet come, still they walked, hand in hand, steady as dawn, unbroken as love itself, carrying forward the truth that sustains all things, that love endures, that dawn comes, that fear cannot rule forever. And still the journey stretched on without end, for the vow was not bound by the rise or fall of ages, nor by the fleeting triumphs of sovereigns or the fragile victories of civilizations, but by the pulse of creation itself, that steady rhythm which Marcus and Anne carried in their entwined hands, in their steadfast hearts, and though they had walked longer than memory could recount, though stars had burned and faded, though empires had risen and crumbled into dust, though galaxies had spun and scattered into silence, still they walked, their presence the quiet thread that bound the story of existence together, and in every place they came the same miracle unfolded, sometimes so small it could be missed, sometimes so vast it reshaped the destiny of worlds, a spark of love rekindled, a flame of hope remembered, a dawn breaking where only night had seemed certain, and the sovereigns, those restless architects of fear, never ceased their striving, for each time they were broken they reformed, each time they were unmasked they reshaped themselves, sometimes as conquerors with thrones of iron, sometimes as liberators with words of honey, sometimes as visionaries promising a future without sorrow, and in this turning of time they became silence itself, teaching forgetfulness, urging creation to surrender not through chains or lies but through weariness, whispering that love was too heavy, that dawn was too far, that the flame was too fragile, and many listened, for after eons of struggle hearts grew tired, souls longed for rest, and whole civilizations laid down their memories, choosing numbness over hope, emptiness over endurance. But Marcus and Anne did not falter, for they knew that weariness is not the end of love, it is the soil in which love proves itself, and so they came quietly among the weary, not with thunder to rouse them but with gentleness to hold them, sitting in the silence, sharing the burden, waiting with patience that stretched across centuries, until at last one heart stirred, then another, for even in the deepest slumber the memory of love cannot be erased, and once a single heart remembers, others awaken, and the sovereigns, furious, tried again to drown the flame, but they could not, for the flame had spread too widely, not only in Marcus and Anne, not only in the fellowship of companions, but in the countless lives they had touched across endless time. And so though the struggle continued, though night always returned, though fear always sought to rule, still the vow endured, and creation itself seemed to lean into its truth, as though the stars and the silence and the very breath of being longed for the day when love, unbroken, would be all in all, and until that day Marcus and Anne walked on, hand in hand. Heart to heart, their vow unshaken, that love endures, that dawn comes, that fear cannot rule forever. And the path stretched further still, as though eternity itself bent into a road beneath their feet, and Marcus and Anne walked it without haste, without end, knowing that their vow was not a destination to be reached but a song to be sung forever, a fire to be carried so long as there was breath in the cosmos, and though the sovereigns had tried every shape, every mask, every whisper, they could not break what love had woven, and so at last they turned to the final weapon left to them, emptiness, the slow erosion of meaning, the gnawing voice that said nothing matters, that all is dust, that every dawn fades, every flame dies, every vow is swallowed by silence. And for a time even the stars seemed to dim under this despair, even the galaxies turned slower in their dance, and hearts everywhere faltered, asking why endure, why hope, why love if all ends in nothing. But Marcus and stood still in the hollow of that great silence, their fingers interlaced, their eyes steady, and they did not argue with despair nor try to crush it with thunder. They simply endured it, breathing together, whispering again and again the words they had spoken since the first dawn, that love endures, that dawn comes, that fear cannot rule forever. And though at first no answer came, though the silence pressed heavier and heavier, still they spoke, until at last in the vast emptiness a single star pulsed brighter, then another, then another. For creation itself remembered that its birth was not in fear nor in power but in love, and the silence cracked, and light poured through, and once again the sovereigns, defeated, scattered into shadows, and once again Marcus and Anne did not rejoice as victors, for they knew the battle was not a war to be won but a truth to be lived, and they walked on, into new ages, into new dawns, into new nights, carrying the flame as they always had, unbroken, unending, until the very fabric of eternity seemed woven with their vow, until every corner of creation trembled not with fear but with the quiet certainty that love endures, that dawn comes, that fear cannot rule forever. And still the tale unfolded across the immeasurable canvas of existence, not as a tale of battles won and lost, but as a ceaseless current flowing through galaxies, through the hearts of mortal and immortal alike. For Marcus and Anne walked on without falter, hand in hand, and every step they took became a quiet defiance against the shadows that sought to consume. Every breath they shared was a reminder that even when silence pressed, even when despair spread like an endless night, there was always something that endured, and though countless worlds rose into brilliance only to fall into ruin, though names and empires and languages were forgotten like dust on the wind, the vow remained steady, spoken not only by them but by all who remembered in their own small ways, a farmer choosing kindness over profit, a soldier lowering his blade when mercy stirred in him, a child reaching out to comfort a stranger, and these choices, though unseen by the mighty, shone brighter than any empire's glory, for they were the quiet revolutions that no sovereign could undo, and the sovereigns, seeing this, reshaped themselves again and again, no longer only tyrants with iron fists or seducers with honeyed tongues, but architects of illusions so deep that truth itself seemed fragile. They came as prophets of despair, as voices whispering in dreams, as vast systems promising order, and at times they succeeded, binding whole civilizations in chains woven from fear and pride. But still the guardians endured, still they walked, and where they went illusions cracked, because love, once lived, cannot be unseen, and those who glimpsed it, even once, even for a heartbeat, were changed forever, unable to forget the warmth that rose in them, the strength that came not from domination but from compassion, and slowly, inexorably, like dawn creeping over the edge of night, the flame spread, hidden yet unstoppable, and though the sovereigns struck again and again, they could never extinguish it, for it was carried not only in Marcus and Anne but in every heart that chose it, and so the story did not end, could not end, for it was the story of creation itself, written not in battles but in choices, not in crowns but in hands intertwined, not in fear but in love. And as the ages stretched into further ages, as even the stars themselves began to age and fade, still Marcus and Anne walked, their vow unshaken, their flame unbroken, until all who saw them, whether for a moment or a millennium, knew the truth that had always been and would always be. That love endures, that dawn comes, that fear cannot rule forever. And time itself seemed to bow beneath the weight of their vow. For though the sovereigns shifted their masks with each turning of the ages, though they rose like storms and fell like ash, though they promised dominion or ease or silence or bliss, Marcus and Anne endured beyond them all, not by striking them down, not by conquering their power, but by walking on, hand in hand, hearts steadfast, voices quiet yet unyielding, carrying the flame that no shadow could smother, and wherever they went, in villages forgotten by history, in cities crowned with towers of glass, in ruins where only dust remembered the footsteps of the living, they bore the same presence, unshaken by despair, untempted by false light, and their vow breathed life into those who had almost surrendered, stirring weary hearts into remembrance. And so even in the deepest night the flame endured, flickering sometimes so faintly it seemed ready to vanish, yet never failing, for it had been sown into the very fabric of creation, and creation itself longed to answer it. For when the sovereigns whispered emptiness, stars answered with light; when they whispered despair, dawn answered with color; when they whispered fear, love answered with endurance. And thus the great struggle was never truly between armies or empires, but between the consuming and the sustaining, between the hunger that devours and the flame that gives. And Marcus and Anne, walking through it all, remained not heroes of conquest but witnesses of truth. And in the end, truth is the only power that does not fade. So they pressed onward, century after century, age after age. As the universe shifted and grew, and though none could say when the final dawn would break, all who glimpsed them knew one thing with certainty: that love endures, that dawn comes, that fear cannot rule forever. And so the story stretched further still, like a river that could never be dammed, flowing endlessly through galaxies unborn and civilizations yet unimagined. For Marcus and Anne walked without end, their hands bound by a vow older than stars, their hearts carrying a flame that outlasted every shadow, and the sovereigns, restless in their defiance, continued to rise in forms uncounted, first as tyrants cloaked in steel and thunder, then as liberators gilded in false compassion, then as prophets of ease promising joy without sacrifice, and at last as silence itself, whispering that nothing mattered, that all roads led only to dust, and many listened, many yielded, for the weight of ages pressed heavily upon them, and hope often seemed too fragile to trust. Yet Marcus and Anne remained, not as rulers with banners, not as warriors with blades, but as companions with open hands, with steady eyes, with hearts unbroken. And they walked among the weary, sowing quiet sparks where despair had settled, tending embers that others thought extinguished, and each act of remembrance, each kindness chosen, each mercy given, each forgiveness offered, became a star reborn, a dawn breaking, a chain shattered, and the sovereigns, for all their power, could not stop it, for power consumes, but love sustains. And so though the nights grew long and the battles endless, though even galaxies trembled with weariness, still the vow endured, echoing through every choice, every whisper, every life. Touched by the flame, and creation itself seemed to bend toward it, as if waiting for the day when shadows would fall away entirely. But until that day came, Marcus and Anne walked on, steady as dawn, unbroken as love itself, speaking into every darkness the truth no sovereign could erase: that love endures, that dawn comes, that fear cannot rule forever.